Lighting's a little bit crazy here, but I just picked this up from Facebook Marketplace. Now, I redid a piece like this several years back when I was kind of just starting out, and I'm really excited to find this one because I know what's under that paint. Or so I thought. When I saw this piece on Facebook Marketplace being given away for free, of course, I wrote right away. 1, because I love the style, but 2, because I wanted a chance to redeem myself for painting one of these back in 2018. Turns out this was way more hassle than I expected. Stay tuned. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. So let's talk about the white elephant in the room here. Clearly, this has been painted. If you guys are familiar with my channel at all, you know that doesn't normally scare me. I do a lot of painted pieces, removing the paint and trying to restore what's underneath. This is a Canadian-made piece. It's a 4-drawer chest of drawers. I'm super thankful that all the drawers actually work properly for once, and there's no smell for once. It's also really sturdy, so with that said, basically the entire work is going to focus around getting this paint off and dealing with whatever I find underneath. Now these 2 gold knobs here on the end are obviously not original, so I'm going to pop those off, and they're still in good shape, nothing wrong with them, so I'll stick them aside. I have a huge stash of knobs, so I'll use these somewhere else. Now for the 3 lower drawers, there's no knobs, they have actual wooden handles, and there's 3 screws at the back, so I took those screws off, hoping that I'd be able to take the handle off to refinish these drawers, but that wasn't happening, and it's not just the paint holding them on, these are actually glued on, so they're not coming off. On the top, we've got some chips around the edges here. Now this is all veneer underneath over pressed wood. The frame is solid wood, the handles and legs are solid wood. Everything else is pressed wood with veneer. I'm going to be using my favorite stripper here, and it's the best one that I've tried that doesn't have methylene chloride in it. But it's still pretty stinky. You want to make sure you're using some sort of breathing protection, as well as gloves. I like to pour it into a smaller container. I just find it a little bit easier to deal with and less chance of spillage. And I can usually get 5 or 6 uses out of these chip brushes before I have to replace them. Now the reason I'm showing this part in regular speed, even though it's a little bit slow and boring, is I want you to see how quickly this stripper works on this type of paint. You guys know that I am not anti-paint. I do paint from time to time, it just depends on what I'm working on. But that said, there's nothing quite as satisfying as when paint bubbles up like this with a stripper and then scrapes off super easily. Yeah, but that's not what happens here. There was nothing super easy about this. I was devastated to scrape that first layer off and find a layer of primer underneath. Now the previous owner had said that she'd done this herself and that she was a complete amateur, so I was quite hopeful that she hadn't prepped at all and just painted over this, but I didn't get that lucky. Primer is a total bugger to try to get out of wood grain. The fact that she used a primer made me a bit nervous that she may have sanded as well, and I know how thin the veneer is on this, so I'm starting to get a little worried by this point. I thought this was going to be a quick and easy, super dramatic flip, but now it's becoming a big pain in the butt. Now to deal with the primer, basically I scraped off all of the paint that I could and then applied some extra stripper on those areas that needed it, and you can see it comes right off the second time, but it is an extra step I was hoping to be able to skip. But as I'm scraping the rest of the primer off the top, another problem came to the surface. So here's the problem with this top. I don't know if you can see this. I was hopeful that she hadn't done any sanding prior to painting, but as you can see here, that is not the case. And it's also quite chewed up along this edge, actually all the edges, which is very common with people just starting out. This edge is particularly bad. So I'm going to be pretty lucky if I can get another sanding out of this top. This is not going how I expected. I'm going to give you a closer view of what I'm talking about here. If I zoom right in, and hopefully you can see this, all of these little sander swirls, and these are caused by an orbital sander and improper sanding. They're really bad here. And then obviously the primer and paint has settled into those deep scratches, and it's really, really common to see this along the edge of pieces. It takes quite a while to get the finesse of an orbital sander and be able to, get to those edges and not wear them down. So I'll come back to that shortly. In the meantime, I'm going to try to get the rest of this paint off, and it's a mess, can't lie. And don't forget the drawers. The drawers are a challenge in themselves. You might think, oh, nice big flat spaces, but around the handles and that little trim piece is actually a piece of metal. It's going to be a little bit tricky to get all the paint off from around that. And I apologize, my voice is a little bit scratchy today for some reason, so hopefully it's not too annoying. So in the beginning I mentioned that I had done a piece like this before, and I knew it was underneath. But as I'm scraping this off, I am actually a little bit surprised. I am looking at walnut veneer here, and the piece that I did was identical in every other way, but it had mahogany veneer on it. And I ended up painting part of it. There was some issues that I just wasn't ready to deal with at that point. But yeah, this is not mahogany, even though it's the exact same thing otherwise. People often ask me what to do with the goop that comes off when I'm using a stripper on a piece, and you really have to go by your local bylaws. So here, if this remains in liquid form, it has to go to hazardous waste. But if it's allowed to dry out, and you probably saw a moment ago there was a piece of cardboard on the ground where I was scraping all of my goop onto, if it's allowed to dry out, the chemicals in the stripper somehow become inert and it can go out with just the regular shop garbage. But that could be different in your area, so you definitely want to check your local bylaws if you want to try out a chemical stripper. And different strippers could have different regulations. For example, like I said, this one is methylene chloride free, so I'm sure that makes a difference. So clearly this is that area that I said was going to be really difficult to get all the paint off around that metal trim. And then this side, top and bottom of the drawer face, is exposed pressed wood under a layer of dark brown paint, essentially. So once I get all that off, then I can go ahead and try to sand this. Now, like I said, it shows on the top that she's already sanded this, so I have to be really careful. Although I didn't find a lot of the same swirl marks and paint staining that I did on the top, so maybe she just kind of glossed over the drawers. But even after sanding, the paint picking continues. There were white flecks everywhere, every little divot, every little chip. You can see there's a chip on the corner of that drawer with some white paint, and then here in the hardware hole, as well as those reddered grooves in the center of the top drawer. All of this has to come out. If I was painting this, what I would do at this point is probably not even bother with that part. I would just seal the wood and then prime and paint. Or if I'm using a paint with a built-in primer, I would just paint over the sealer. What I would like to implore people to do that like to paint furniture, if you've got a rough surfacing, you have to sand it back to bare wood, and that happens sometimes. Just seal it with something first, like some shellac or some other coating to isolate the wood from the paint. It makes my job and other people that strip paint sometimes, it makes their job a lot easier and also helps preserve the life of the piece. Now, normally I kind of skip through, glaze over these sections of the work involved, but in this case, I really want to show you how much work was involved, because this took almost a week and a half of paint picking and careful sanding, and you'll see how I deal with the top as well. This was so much more work than I was expecting, and as a furniture flipper, obviously your main goal is to make a buck, but something happens usually along the way in every furniture flipper's career where they kind of evolve, if you will, from just trying to make a quick buck to making certain that these pieces have an extended life and time out of the landfill. And when that happens, you start to become a little bit more careful about things like this, like painting on raw wood, because not everyone is going to take a week and a half to pull paint out of every pore of this piece. Just food for thought if you're in the business or thinking about it. It's just a quick little thing that you can do to kind of help preserve the piece moving forward. Now you can see on the back here that they painted the back side of these side panels, and the problem is the veneer on top has a bit of a bevel, and because of that, even though I've done the side panel, that bevel with paint is still showing when you look at it from the side. So I either have to sand the paint off the bevel and expose the edge of this, or I can sand this back edge of the side panel inward to kind of sneak up on that bevel line and just eliminate it entirely, and that's what I opted to do here. Okay, so this top, if you remember, there were a ton of sander swirls. The edges were a little bit raised, so they had to be sanded flat, which means that in some spots I needed to sand through the veneer into the presswood to get it flat. Now, this isn't always a big deal, and sometimes you can actually paint those flattened areas. Basically what you would do is you would sand it smooth, and you can see that area I was talking about here. You'd sand it smooth, seal it, and then you can actually do some painting with special markers and paints and pigments to blend that into the rest of the veneer. But there were some other issues here, and I'm opting to replace the top. That said, let's say this top was perfect except for just paint. This is how you would get rid of it. Add a little bit of stripper, and using a brass bristled brush, you just go with the grain until you get all of that paint out. And on open grade woods like walnut, it actually works really well. And I'll show you in a moment kind of the before and after of these areas. On a top where you don't have any other issues except paint in the grain, this is a great way to get that little bit of extra out. This is what that looked like before. You can see certain angles, you can really see all that paint, and this is what it looks like after using the brass brush. So it is really effective. Now again, if I were not replacing this top, my next step would then be to deal with some of the residual staining, which you can see here. And to do that, I'm just showing you what you would do. You would use some oxalic acid. Now from this angle, the top actually looks really good, but it's not. It still has a ton of those swirl marks that are just too deep to sand out because the veneer is so thin. I am going to be putting a new piece of veneer on. Finally made it down to the legs, but the paint picking continues. Now this is a little bit above and beyond. Most people wouldn't bother trying to get some of that out, but you guys know me. So the frame here is actually elm, and I need to stain the elm darker so that it will match the walnut veneer. But I don't want it to be a perfect match. I actually want to make it a little bit darker than the walnut veneer. There's always someone in these flips that comments, oh, well, you took something that was unique, as in like with the paint, and turned it back into a brown box. And I see their point. Not everybody likes brown wood. And this piece in particular is fairly boring, were it not for the pulls on the top drawer and those little metal trim pieces on the lower drawers. So I'm trying to add a little bit of extra contrast just to give it a little bit more visual interest. So I'm opting to use this water-based stain in the color walnut, and I'll actually be doing 2 coats of it to get it as opaque as possible. And I'll also use that same stain on the drawers where that exposed presswood is. And this is literally what they had before. They just had a thick dark paint or stain covering that up. But I'm actually going to be using it on the handles as well. And with the 2 coats, it's going to darken it up quite a bit and give it a bit of contrast with the walnut veneer. I always like to clean up the drawer boxes themselves as well, so I just did a very light sanding and then sealed with a light coat of lacquer inside the drawers. Now speaking of lacquer, I'm going to be sealing everything first with Easy Vinyl Sealer and a lacquer finish. And then I'm actually going to be using that water-based stain as a bit of a glaze to darken up some of the lighter areas. I'm also going to flip this down, do the underside, and then the underside of these trim pieces as well. No one's going to see it, but that kind of bugs me, so I added some extra stain there too. Now, as far as hardware goes, I went through a couple of options that would have been okay, but because of the way the holes are positioned on the drawer face, I need something that is going to hang down a little bit. Now, I did try just a normal sort of mid-century style knob, and you can see it would have looked nice had the holes been centered. But the original hardware on this piece sits a little bit lower. It's kind of a toggle, and I know this because I've done this piece before. And this middle section here where you're thinking, oh, that must have been a handle, it wasn't. It actually had two knobs there. This is the piece that I did back in 2018. Literally identical dresser, except instead of walnut veneer, it actually had mahogany veneer. And I knew exactly what the hardware looked like. Now, I love to stash things. So I have this box of old hardware, different styles. There's a lot of French provincial, some mid-century stuff, but I knew that I had at least a couple of those knobs left over from another piece a while back. Question is, do I have enough? Because I need 4. So I'm digging through here and yep, I see them. This is the piece right here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and it actually turned out I had 6, so I still have 2 in case I need to replace one down the road, but I was super happy to find the original pulls. I don't particularly like them, but these would have come with the piece originally, and it will help give a little pop of color or bling, if you will, to an otherwise brown box. And you can see how much better those hang there and kind of fill that space. They're pretty dirty, so first I'm going to clean them up using some Barkeeper's Friend and a 1500 grit Merc Milan pad. And even though the plating is still okay, I do have to paint those metal strips on the drawers, so I'm going to be spraying these two just so that the two will match. And the spray paint I use is actually, it's a metal paint, and it's so hard to find now. I don't know if the company went out of business or what happened. It's really hard to find this stuff, at least here in Canada, but it is my absolute favorite for metal paint. And you can see it's not really changing the color, it's just kind of enhancing it, and I'm going to do the same thing with those metal strips on the drawers. Now, I didn't really show a lot of it because it's kind of boring to just watch me spray back and forth for, 15 minutes, but I ended up doing 6 coats of lacquer on everything, and you could see in that shot the contrast between the handle and the drawer. At this point in the project, I was not feeling it. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just too boring or too kind of monotone, but I actually hated this piece. And I remember Andrea came out and asked how things were going, and I was kind of in a funk and just really not liking this. But I couldn't really figure out what I would have done differently. Like, I didn't really want to paint it. Not that that would be the end of the world, but it just wasn't turning out kind of as dramatic as I was hoping. And having spent almost a week and a half on it, it just was a bit underwhelming for me. And because I wasn't super excited with how everything was going, I saved the top for last, which is kind of unusual. Normally you would do it all at once, but veneer is expensive, I'll say that, and I didn't want to waste a piece of veneer if I was hating how everything turned out and was going to end up painting it anyway. But I got this far, and I mean, it's not terrible, it's just not really my favorite piece in the world, but I decided to move forward and put a new top on it. Now, this is what I have, and you can see that the way the veneer is cut is exactly the same graining as on the side, so it's going to match perfectly. This is a 3M backed veneer, and there's different types of veneer you can get. You can get a paperback, which you would normally put on with something like a contact cement or some other contact adhesive. I don't have any of that at the moment, but I do have this. Once I have it cut, I'm going to just lay it out, make sure I have the size correct, and then I can peel off the backing. Now you can do this in segments, which is usually easier to do, like peel a little bit, position it, peel a little bit, keep going. In this case, it's pretty manageable, it's just a small piece. But of course, I accidentally let it hit, and you can see how much that sticks right away, and I'm having a bit of a panic moment there, but we got through it, and I'm going to very carefully put this down. What kind of threw me off there is that the front is curved a little bit, so if you line it up at the edges without accounting for the extra depth of the curve, you're going to do exactly what I did and screw it up. Now this works by pressure, so I've got a burnishing stick here that I use for veneer. Some pre-glued options like edge banding work with heat. This is not one of those, this is by pressure. And you can see it sticks really well. This stuff is meant more for non-porous surfaces, but I haven't had any issues putting this over other wood. It holds extremely well. And I'm just going to carefully trim it all, give it a light sanding, and then I'm going to repeat the process I did on the rest of the piece with the Easy Vinyl Sealer. I did, I think, 3 coats of that just to kind of isolate the wood. Now this Easy Vinyl Sealer is a bit like a primer and sets you up for the lacquer later on. I usually do a very light scuff sanding with a fine grit in between. Just make sure that everything adheres really well. And then I used a little bit of that same stain to kind of glaze the top. Now normally you would use an oil-based glaze, but I was trying to keep everything a similar color. And then sealed that layer with the Easy Vinyl Sealer before moving on to the lacquer. Now there were still a lot of little flecks, and I tried to use a marker here to get as many of those as I could. It's not a big piece, but when you talk about how small a pour is, you know, it's hard to get all of the paint out, but I did my best. And I almost forgot to put these 3 screws back into the handle that I couldn't remove anyway. But yeah, here we are. So looking back at what I started with, I had high hopes for this piece. I feel a little bit let down, and I can't really put my finger on why. Maybe you guys can help me out with that. It just didn't have the sort of wow factor I was expecting, and the paint took so much longer to remove than I expected, and that was a bit of a drag as well. Let me know what you guys think of this makeover, if you would have just painted it or if you would have done something a little bit different. You are going to notice it's a little bit darker than I anticipated, but I had to do that to try to get rid of any remaining paint in the pores. It turned out okay, but like I said, it's not my favorite piece, and I'm sure you guys can tell just by the tone of my voice. But yeah, let me know what you guys think down below. I hope you enjoy the reveal. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.